For everybody here, my name is Alan Gernhardt. I'm Executive Director of the Virginia Freedom of Information Advisory Training, or excuse me, Advisory Council, and welcome to FOIA Training. In this case, it is for local elected officials and members and executive directors of EDAs and IDAs, which of course includes the soil water conservation districts as elected officials. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I've got a PowerPoint here that we're using for this training, and I want to make sure if anyone cannot see that, please let us know in the chat that you cannot see it. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and get started. This should take about 45 minutes to an hour to get through the PowerPoint, and then we'll have a little time for those who want to stay to do Q&A. First slide here is probably the best thing I can give you today because it has our contact information. For those who don't know, a big part of what we do is to answer questions from government and from citizens and from the media on how FOIA works, what are the requirements, whether an exemption applies, all that kind of stuff. So this is how you can get to our website. You can get to us by email or you can call us. I'll tell you that because of COVID-19, our office is teleworking. So if you call that number there, it will lead you probably to a voicemail, which will then get forwarded to me. If you need to call me directly, you can feel free to do so. The number would be 804-698-1877. And while we are teleworking, that'll forward to my cell phone. So that's probably the fastest way to reach me is the 1877 number. Okay, the training contents. This is what we're going to be doing today. We're going to have a short introduction. We're going to talk a little bit about what the requirements are for local elected officials. Then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of the procedural rules for public records and public meetings, talk a little bit about remedies and penalties if things go wrong. And then at the end, there are some other resources for further questions. Those are mostly designed for local governing bodies, school boards, and constitutional officers. For you, you'll just probably want to contact either your own attorneys or DCR. Kendall is probably your number one person here. So on the introduction, what we're going to talk about is a little bit about the FOIA Council, what we do. We're going to talk about the purpose and policy of FOIA. But before we get there, I want to talk to you a little bit about just the structure of FOIA and how it's set up in the code so that you can find things for yourself. The first few sections of FOIA, 2.2-3700 through 2.2-3703.1, are the general provisions. These are things like the policy statement, definitions. Some public bodies that are not subject to FOIA are listed there. A few of the requirements, some of the public disclosure stuff, rules about court orders and subpoenas being different than FOIA, all the kind of generalized stuff. That's followed by the records, procedures, and exemptions. That is 2.2-3704 through 2.2-3706. And because I know I'm going to do it, I will refer to things sometimes as 3704, 3705, something like that. And I won't say the 2.2. All of FOIA is within Title 2.2 of the code, so you can assume the 2.2 is there when you look it up. But anyway, the records are 3704 through 3706. That also includes the training requirements in that section. 2.2-3704.2 is the training requirement for FOIA officers. 2.2-3704.3 it sets out the training requirement for the local elected officials. That section is followed by meetings, procedures, and exemptions, which includes open meetings, closed meetings, and electronic meetings. That's all in 2.2-3707 through 2.2-3712. And then finally, FOIA ends with remedies and penalties in 3713 through 3715. Something you should know about this presentation, it is available on our website under our reference materials page. You can get this whole PowerPoint, and all of the things in here that look like hyperlinks are in fact hyperlinks. If you click on those, it will take you to the appropriate section of the code on the legislative information system. Okay, a little bit about the council. What we do, we are a state legislative branch advisory council. We provide a legislative forum for studies and recommendations to the General Assembly. As examples, for this year, even though it's kind of shortened due to COVID-19 and the special session of the General Assembly, we actually had 3 subcommittees, and we are recommending 4 pieces of legislation to the 2021 session of the General Assembly. Those are covering some areas concerning electronic meetings, some access to personal contact information, and the last one is access to criminal information, criminal investigative files. In addition to serving as a legislative forum, the main thing we do day to day as staff is, as I said, answer questions from government, citizens, and media. We do that mostly by phone and email. but we also publish advisory opinions and educational materials that you can find on the website, and we provide training presentations like this one. Now, at the last bullet point, you will see what we are not. We are not the FOIA cops. We are not judges. We are not the police. We don't investigate FOIA complaints. We do not enforce FOIA. Enforcement's always going to go through the court system, not through us. We do try to help resolve any sort of FOIA disputes on an informal basis, but we don't have the power to issue orders or anything like that. So if you're having a dispute with somebody, you can always feel free to call us up and we'll try to help as best we can by explaining what FOIA requires and maybe making some suggestions for a course of action. But if somebody needs a court order, if they want to, actually make a public body do something, they've got to go to court. Okay, the purpose and policy of FOIA, it's one of the few laws that actually has a policy statement at the beginning. And it says the point of FOIA is to provide ready access to public records and free entry to meetings of public bodies to the citizens of the Commonwealth. It also says some rules of construction that FOIA is to be liberally construed to promote awareness of governmental activities and operations, but all of the exemptions from public access, meaning exemptions where you can withhold records or close meetings, have to be narrowly construed. So when we talk about FOIA, we often talk about a balance between the people's right to know versus government's need to function. And sometimes the need to function is going to require we need to keep things close to the vest. We need to be able to keep some secrets for certain things. But the general rule set out in the policy tilts that balance in favor of the right to know. So public's right to know generally wins if you have a question. Finally, it also says no record should be withheld or meeting closed to the public unless it is specifically made exempt. So it sets out the default rule: all public records and all public meetings must be open to the public unless you have a specific exemption. Next, talk a little bit about the requirements on local elected officials. And I would note here, constitutional officers are subject to FOIA. They are considered public bodies, but only for records purposes, not meetings purposes. For everybody else who's an elected official and most appointed officials as well, you're going to be subject to both the meetings and the records requirements. The requirement, and this is the new one that just went into effect this year, and the purpose of this training is to satisfy it. You have to receive FOIA training either from us at the FOIA Council or your own local government attorney. Normally, it'll be within 2 months of assuming office. For this first year, any training from January 1 through December 31 will count to satisfy the requirement. The training can be live or online, and you need to repeat it every 2 years since your last training. Finally, note that the clerk of the body keeps your records, not us. There's no requirement to report the training to the council. You only have to keep your own records. So when you're done with this, my understanding is Kindle is going to distribute a certificate that you can fill out, and then you can give that to your clerk to report that you have received your training today. Next, this requirement is actually older. This has been in the law for quite a while. It says that everyone who's elected, re-elected, appointed, or reappointed must be given a copy of FOIA within 2 weeks and read and become familiar with it. If you need one, you can always get a copy on our website. And again, I'll note that if you get the PowerPoint directly, that is a hyperlink. Finally, I like to note that other laws may also apply to access. Depending on who you are, what type of public body, there can be different laws. And I'm going to give you some examples in a minute. But the important point about that is sometimes I have to tell people, well, here's what FOIA says. I can talk to you about FOIA, but our statutory authority is limited to FOIA. So if we have to stray to other laws and it requires an interpretation outside of FOIA, I'm going to have to tell you to talk to your own attorney or other counsel. Some examples of that, if you were a court clerk or if you're seeking access to court records, the majority of those court records are actually not subject to FOIA. They're subject to the court's own laws and the rules of the Supreme Court. For local governing bodies, they have rules in Title 15.2. EDAs and IDAs also have some rules there. 22.1 is the code title for school boards and K through 12 education. And I use the last one, 58.1-3, as part of the tax code. It says you shall not release certain tax information. That's specifically, of course, all the finance officials are the ones who are most likely to have that, but anyone can end up having tax information. And if you do end up having that in your official capacity, 58.1-3 says you shall not release it. And then it has certain rules where you can. So those are all things outside of FOIA, and there are many more. That's just a few examples. Okay, turning to the nuts and bolts procedural stuff. For public records, again, we're going through 2.2-3704 through 2.2-3706. And the goal of this, I'm not going to try to give you every detail because it's a whole lot of stuff, but we're going to try to learn to recognize and respond to FOIA requests on a basic level. Now, most of the time, for most elected officials, staff people are going to handle most of your requests. Usually something comes in and they're going to want a record, more held by the agency rather than held by you personally. But sometimes that's not true. Sometimes they're asking for something only you have. And so that's why you do need to know this. And also, because there's a time limit, you need to know when to get it to staff. So first rule, again, repeating the policy, all public records are presumed to be open unless they're specifically made exempt. So we need to know what's a public record. The definition in the code talks about all writings and recordings that consist of letters, words, or numbers, or their equivalent, however stored and regardless of physical form or characteristics, prepared or owned by or in the possession of a public body, its officers, employees, or agents in the transaction of public business. So going through those 3 bullet points, breaking them down a little bit. Notice all writings, recordings, however stored, regardless of physical form or characteristics. So the important takeaways from that is it's got to be a record, but we don't care what kind of record. So for example, if we were doing this presentation and no one was recording it, and someone came and said, hey, I heard you did a FOIA training, can I get a copy of that? The answer would be no, nobody recorded it, so we don't have a copy of it. We would have a copy of the PowerPoint, so you could say, well, we didn't record the training presentation itself, but we do have a PowerPoint. However, I do understand this one is being recorded, so the answer is yes, it is being recorded. We do have a record. The other part about that, keep in mind as elected officials, you all probably have other things, whether it's a personal email account, a Facebook account, other social media, your own home computers. You have another job, you have a work account and a work computer over there, that kind of thing. That doesn't matter for FOIA purposes. If you're doing SWCD business on any account or any device, it's going to be a public record. If you create a record, we don't care how you store it. We don't care about the physical form or characteristics, the type of record. We don't care if it's an audio recording, a video recording, audio visual, handwritten notes, typewritten on an old mechanical typewriter, something you did on the computer yesterday. Doesn't matter. Any type of record can be a record, so keep that in mind. Next part of it, though, prepared, owned by, possession of, public body, its officers, employees, or agents, and in the transaction of public business. So if you did it for work as part of your SWCD business, it's almost definitely going to be a public record. On the other hand, if it's something somebody else did and you don't have a copy of it, it's not your public record because you don't have it. It's not in your possession, you don't own it, and you didn't prepare it. At the same time, if you did something, but it's not for SWCD business, it's, you have a friend invite you to a barbecue. Not likely with COVID-19, but in normal situations, something like that. If my old favorite, I haven't used this one in a while, somebody sends you some cute pictures of cats with funny little captions on them. Okay, the little kitten going jazz hands, that kind of stuff. Generally speaking, that stuff is not transactional public business. So even though it's a record, and even if you have it on a government account, it's technically not a public record subject to FOIA because it's not about public business. The last bullet point here is just to note some versions of FOIA out there in every state and the federal government and pretty much every country, they have their own version of it. Some of them specifically exclude drafts, preliminary versions of things. Virginia FOIA does not. It's silent about that. So a draft version of a record is still a public record, and it's only exempt if there's a specific exemption that applies to it. Okay, moving on to debunk a few FOIA myths. First thing here, it addresses access to public records. As I said, it does not require you to answer questions, to give interviews, to provide explanations to people. If someone says, hey, thanks for the record, but I don't understand it, can you explain this? That's up to you. You can explain it if you want to, but FOIA does not require it. FOIA only requires you to produce existing public records. Next part, inspect or copy. That is the requester's choice. I sometimes see public bodies say something to somebody, oh, well, you can come in and look at it, but I'm not going to give you a copy. That's not our choice. That's the requester's choice. They get to pick. Okay, next, it's not free. People think freedom of information, therefore the information is free. Well, that's not the case. There are rules for charges. There are limits on charges, but you are allowed to charge. We're going to talk about that more in just a minute. Next, FOIA exemptions generally do not prohibit release. And this is where we talk about the difference between an exemption in FOIA versus a prohibition. As I said earlier, there's a lot of laws outside of FOIA that affect access. And a lot of the time with the records laws, they are prohibitions. They will say you shall not release this record, period. By contrast, a FOIA exemption almost always has prefatory language in the beginning that says, the following records may be disclosed by the custodian, but they're not required to be disclosed. They're exempt from mandatory disclosure, but they still may be disclosed unless they're prohibited by some other law. So classic example of that, and excuse me, my phone is ringing. But the classic example, of course, first exemption of FOIA is personnel records. General rule is you do not have to give personnel records to other parties, but you do have to give them to the person who is the subject of the record. There are some exceptions to that. Things like name and salary and job position do have to be released. But for example, somebody's performance evaluations, their credentials, their training history, prior education, prior job history, all that kind of stuff is personnel records that you generally do not have to share. However, if you think about, anytime you hire a new executive director, anytime a city hires a new city manager, a county gets a new county administrator, a school gets a new school superintendent, somebody hires a new police chief, someone runs for elected office as a sheriff, almost all of these high-level positions, people either running for the election or in the running for the position, then they get the position. At some point, they share that kind of information. They say, oh, I have a degree from this university or college. My prior job experience, I used to work here, here, and these are some of my accomplishments. People want to share that stuff. They voluntarily share it. And this is why personnel, it's a discretionary exemption. You can choose to release that stuff. However, other things, and one I mentioned earlier was that tax code provision, it says you shall not. It says you cannot release certain tax records, and where it applies, it makes it a criminal misdemeanor to release those records. It does not give you any discretion. It says no, you just can't do it. So that's the difference between an exemption where you can choose to release something, but you don't have to, versus a prohibition where you don't have the choice, you just cannot release. Final one here, informal versus formal requests. I get calls sometimes from somebody saying, well, I asked for these records and then they told me I needed to contact you to make a formal request. Is there a form I need to fill out? The answer is no. There is no difference between a formal and an informal request. FOIA specifically says you do not have to say FOIA in order for FOIA's rules to apply. So anytime somebody comes in and asks to inspect or copy a record, and it's a public record, unless there's some other procedure in place, like if it's a court subpoena or something like that, it is a FOIA request, even if they don't say FOIA. And there's no requirement to put it in writing either. So be aware of that. Someone just comes in and says, hey, can I look at your meeting minutes from that last meeting? That's a FOIA request right there. So be aware of that. Next, who can make a FOIA request? Virginia specifically grants rights to citizens of the Commonwealth and representatives of certain media, newspapers, magazines, radio, and TV with circulation or broadcasting in or into the Commonwealth. Had a conversation with someone from out of state just yesterday. Our advice, as you will see here, go ahead and respond to people anyway, because all they have to do is get a Virginia citizen to make the same request. And this is not hard at all. There are websites out there where they can do it. I've heard of people hiring out as professional services to do it. Anybody doing business in the Commonwealth is supposed to have a registered agent. That's usually a Virginia attorney. People also, just if they have enough interest to be asking for records here, there's a good chance they already know somebody here. So if you say, no, you're out of state, I don't have to do this, they just say, fine, I'm gonna get my cousin, my business partner, my registered agent, I'm gonna go to muckrock.com, wherever it is, they're gonna get a Virginia citizen, and you end up doing twice the work. So we recommend go ahead and respond to them anyway. However, last bullet point there, since they can't actually enforce FOIA against you because they don't have FOIA rights, if you're dealing with them directly and they're out of state, you can be a little looser with the procedure because again, they can't enforce it against you, so you don't have to follow it quite as strictly. Usually the problem we hear is about collecting money for out-of-state requests, so just keep in mind, since they're out of state, they cannot enforce the usual charging rules, and you can ask them for the money up front. All right, turning to how to request public records, they have to do only a few things. One, identify the records with reasonable specificity. We've given that a very practical interpretation, meaning, can you tell what they want? If you can tell what they want, good enough. If you have to jump through a bunch of hoops and try to figure it out and it's not clear, or if they just use really vague language, then we recommend contact them, talk to them, and try to work out a deal. What you can do, though, you can ask them for name and legal address, and it specifically says you can require it. So if they refuse to provide name and legal address, technically they haven't made their FOIA request properly. So you can require name and legal address. As I mentioned before, they don't have to put it in writing. They don't have to say FOIA. And also, their purpose does not matter. The Virginia Supreme Court looked at that back in 1988, said it doesn't matter why they want a record or what they plan to do with it. FOIA just asks, okay, are they a citizen or media? And is the record exempt or prohibited? If they are citizen or media and it's not exempt or prohibited, you have to release it regardless of what their purpose is. So purpose doesn't matter. And again, we just reiterate, it is the requester's choice to inspect or to receive copies. All right, on responding to a request, this is where I like to hold up one hand to remind everybody, you have a built-in FOIA cheat sheet if you have 5 fingers on one hand, because there are 5 working days to respond after the request is received, and there are 5 responses to choose from. So 5 working days. Keep in mind the first day is the day after you receive it. So if you get a request today, tomorrow would be day 1 to respond. And we generally do not count weekends and legal holidays. We are smack dab in the middle of holiday season, so the counting gets a little bit weird. Keep in mind, is your office open for business? If they're open, count it as a day. Half day, count it as a day. If the office is closed, though, no, it's not a working day. Next, failure to respond is deemed a denial and a violation of FOIA. So make sure you always respond. Don't ignore a request. Don't shuffle it off to the side and forget about it for a while. Make sure you always respond and respond within the time limit. Next, creation of new records not required. This is usually we see somebody comes in and they might ask you for something that you have related records, but you don't have it quite in the form they want, or they want you to reorganize or something. You don't have to do that. You only have to provide existing records. My personal favorite example of this, because I was a psych major in undergrad, there's a theory that as temperature goes up, people get angry basically, and there's more violent crime as a result. But once it hits a certain temperature, and I forget what it is, it's over 100, I think, violent crime drops dramatically because everybody goes inside and they get in the air conditioning and in the shade and they just want to cool off. So in order to test that theory, somebody might come and say, okay, I want to get a map from, whoever, local government, that's showing me what are the crime statistics by neighborhood with superimposed weather data on it. Well, most people don't make that map. In the 16 years I've done this, I've had one person say they actually do make that map, but for the most part, they don't do it. But what people do have is maps of an area of neighborhood by neighborhood. The police have crime stats. You can get weather data from NOAA or the National Weather Service. And if you don't have the thing, you would say, well, I only have this part of it. I don't have to create the thing if I don't want to. So I'm going to give you my part of it, sure, but you can go build it yourself. If somebody wanted to, they could also make an agreement with the requester, last bullet point here, on the production of records. This is actually stated in the FOIA policy statement that the public body, its officers and employees shall make reasonable efforts to reach an agreement with a requester on the production of records. It's also repeated a couple other places in the procedural section. So keep in mind, anytime these default rules are not going to work, you can go ahead and make an agreement with the requester to fit that transaction. When you reach that agreement, it'll control. I do recommend, as I said earlier, they don't have to put a FOIA request in writing, but it's a good idea. Same with agreements. It's always a good idea to write these things down just so you have recourse in case there's questions or problems later. Even if all that means, if they won't write it down, you write it down. Or if you reach an agreement with them, talking to them, put it in an email and send it to them and say, hey, as we discussed today, we're going to do this. And that way they can see it, they can read it. And if they take issue with it, they can get back to you. But otherwise, you have something in case things go wrong. And you can say, Your Honor, well, this is what we agreed to, and I know because I wrote it down. Here it is. All right, moving on to the 5 responses. First response is going to be to provide the records. Second and third responses are to say no, either entirely or in part. Number 4 is to say you don't have it. The records could not be found or do not exist. And number 5 is say you need more time. If you're going to provide the records, the only thing you have to do is provide the records. Talk about the consequence of choice here a little bit. Some people ask me, well, don't you have to send a cover letter? And don't we have to sign the cover letter? Well, first off, FOIA doesn't require a cover letter for when you're going to give them the records. All you have to do is give them the records. As far as signatures, FOIA doesn't say a word about signatures. Don't say anything about that. So if you want to send them a signed cover letter, you can go ahead and do it. But the consequence of that choice is you've created another public record, because responding to a FOIA request is part of your public business. So I happen to know from the Library of Virginia that records of FOIA requests are to be kept for 3 years. So if you do create that cover letter, well, now you have to also keep it for 3 years. This is not a good or a bad thing. It's kind of like if you have the choice of having a conversation with an employee or a fellow member of your SWCD, you can go ahead and talk to them. And if there's no record created, there's no record created. If you send them an email or a text message or a Facebook post about business, though, that's public business, now you've created a record. The consequence of the choice may be subject to record retention rules and may be subject to FOIA. This is not a good or bad thing. This is not a moral choice. This is just a be aware. If you put things down in a record form, then you've created a record, and there are consequences for FOIA and record retention. Now, for the number 2, 3, 4, and 5 responses, all of those do require that you respond in writing. So there will be some sort of cover letter for all of those. For number 2, if you're withholding records entirely, you have to identify the volume of what you're withholding, the subject of what you're withholding, and you have to cite the exemption or prohibition that says you either can withhold the records or that you must withhold the records if it's a prohibition. For the number 3, when you're providing in part, withholding in part, this is going to be where you're redacting records, things like pulling out names or social security numbers or something like that. When you do that, you have to, again, cite your exemption or prohibition always. You have to also identify the subject matter of what's being withheld, but you do not have to do volume if you're giving them part of it. And the reasoning would be they can see what's missing, so they don't need you to say how much. For number 4, the records could not be found or do not exist. Again, you have to respond in writing, and you're basically telling them we don't have it. It could be that the record retention was up, the records were destroyed. Could be they asked you at your SWCD and it's not a record you keep, it's a neighboring jurisdictions and you need to direct them over there. If you do know that somebody else has the record they want, then you do have to provide them contact information so that they can reach the other public body. On the last one for time, I want to talk a little bit about this. You always have your 5 working days to start with. If that's not going to be enough, you can respond in writing in those first 5 days and explain why you can't respond in the first 5, and you can invoke up to 7 more. So the total then is 12 working days. Given weekends, holidays, that's usually about 2.5 to 3 weeks total time. So that's usually enough for most requests. If it is not, your next step is to negotiate with them. Again, this is one of the places where it repeats the directive to try to reach an agreement with the requester, and the vast, vast majority of the time, people can do that. Usually it's things like, oh, well, you asked me for something, and the way you phrased it is going to be a huge search, but maybe we can narrow it down. What are you really looking for? And you talk to them about it. You can always negotiate the scope of the request. You can offer to trade time for money. You can work out whatever deal you need to, but that step is to work out a deal. If you cannot work out a deal, the final step in the timing procedures would be to petition a court for more time. We used to tell people that that just didn't happen because it really didn't. In the last few years, I have heard of a few people filing such petitions, so it might. But again, basic rule is you get 5 days always. You can invoke 7 more. After that, you negotiate, and if you can't reach an agreement, you go to court. All right, a little bit about exemptions and redaction. Again, just to reiterate, most of the exemptions are discretionary. They say you may withhold records, but you can also choose to release them. They're not the same as prohibitions that say you cannot release things. When something is exempt or prohibited, you withhold that portion and only that portion. You can only withhold an entire record if everything in it is exempt or prohibited from release. So if it's something where, chapter 1 is a review of the performance of the whole district overall for the last year, that's probably a bunch of aggregate information. It's probably all open, but then let's say you have an appendix to that, which is individual reviews of employees. and then maybe you have some, oh, I don't know, federal farm tract numbers or something like that that's actually parts of those, the employee reviews, the farm tract number, stuff like that, but any aggregate statistical data, overall department-wide stuff, that stuff is usually open. All right, talk about charges a little bit. FOIA says you may make reasonable charges not to exceed the actual cost incurred in accessing, duplicating, supplying, or searching for the requested records. That may is important because it's permissive. You may charge, you do not have to charge. A lot of other versions of FOIA have specific waiver provisions. Some examples you might hear are someone coming in and saying, I'm a reporter and this request is for information that's in the public interest, so please waive the fees. Or I'm an indigent person, I simply can't afford it, please waive the fees. Or I am a student and this is for an educational purpose, please waive the fees. Now, all of those may be good reasons to waive fees, but FOIA in Virginia does not have specific waiver provisions. We just have this word may. So if you want to take those things into account and say, oh, I'm not going to charge you, that's fine. If you want to say that you're going to charge anyway, you're allowed to do that as well. The word reasonable is going to be a legal term of art. Typical first-year law student answer, what a reasonable, objective, prudent person would do under the facts of any given situation is what's reasonable. Obviously, that's going to vary depending on the facts, and from a legal perspective, if you've got a dispute of fact, only a court can resolve that. So the only time you're going to know for sure whether charges are reasonable is if you end up getting sued over them. So we don't want that, so we try to avoid it. Only a court can say what's reasonable. I can't, but I can talk to you about what's actual and whether you're within your actual cost limits. Keep in mind here that electronic records, are going to be different than paper records. In the electronic records world, accessing, the best example of accessing fees I've heard of is if you have to get some sort of IT staff to pull something off of a hard drive or from a backup disk, something that's going to take, outside the ordinary course. Simply logging into your computer for the day is something pretty much everybody does every day anyway. You're not going to charge for that. Similarly, duplicating and supplying for electronic records. Usually these days it's attaching something to an email and hitting send. Might be posting to a website or a file transfer or a Dropbox or something like that. Typically, those are going to be nominal fees in the electronic world. There's usually very little fee there. Paper world, on the other hand, accessing may just be flipping through a file cabinet or going to basement storage, but it could also be going to an offsite storage facility. Duplicating and supplying is actually making copies. You may be putting some, piece of paper in an envelope and a stamp on it. It may be shipping several banker's boxes full of paper. All of those things are going to add up to a different set of costs than with electronic records. But where we see the most cost these days is that last term, searching. When you're searching for the records, the Supreme Court of Virginia has said that this whole process includes what they call exclusion review. I use a funnel analogy here, going from the top of the funnel down. Top of the funnel, you have all your records. They ask for a certain subset, so you're searching for which records are responsive to their request. Then you're going to go through those and say, hey, is anything here prohibited or exempt, and am I going to withhold it? And then at the bottom you have, okay, this is the stuff I've got that responds to their request. It's not prohibited, and it either isn't exempt or you're going to choose to release it anyway, and that's what you're giving out at the bottom of the funnel. That whole process is exclusion review. The Supreme Court has said you may charge for that. So you can charge the hourly rate for the person doing the work. Now, see that first bullet point, cannot charge more than actual cost. That's something you can actually compute. Keep in mind though, this is another good point where people negotiate a lot. I'll give you a real example. I tell people to think in kind of ballpark figures and think about whether you get sticker shock if you heard the charges coming your way. So a real example is a woman several years back when they were talking about closing Sweetbriar College. She wanted all the information the Attorney General's office had on it. The way she phrased her request was going to require them to do a pretty big search, and they gave her an estimate of $19,500, if I remember correctly. At that point, I asked, okay, do you want some records about closing a school, or do you want to buy a new car? $19,500 is pretty much enough to at least put down a pretty good down payment, if not buy a car outright. So you put it in those terms and you go, well, all right, that seems excessive. She was upset. She actually wrote to the Times Dispatch about it. They wrote up an article. You can go research that in their archives if you want. But what happened, I talked to the Attorney General's office and they said, well, the way she phrased it, it was going to require every employee of the AG's office to search their records for anything to do with Sweetbriar College. That would have been 200 support staff and 400 attorneys. So then you get to thinking about it and you go, well, you know, a new attorney, even then, it's probably paid $100 an hour as a commercial rate and everything. 400 attorneys, even if they could search all their records in 1 hour, that would still be, you know, 400 times 100. Wait a second, that's about $40,000 right there. If they did it in a half an hour, that would be $20,000. And that's not even counting the support staff. And their estimate was $19,500. That actually sounds probably lower than actual cost, doesn't it? Well, it's still a lot of money, and she wasn't happy with it. So she talked to them. We went kind of back and forth, and they narrowed it down to the people who were actually involved and an actual time frame for when they were considering closing the school and all that stuff. And by narrowing it, they got it down. I think it was still several $100s because it was a lot of stuff still, but it was much more reasonable and a much smaller request. So that's, you know, a good example of negotiation. Next 2 bullet points, estimates and advance deposits. These laws have been changed this year a little bit to clarify them and give everybody, again, a chance to negotiate. It used to say that requesters can ask for an estimate in advance, but it did not say anything about stopping the clock. On the other hand, it said if the estimated costs were going to exceed $200, the public body could get an advance deposit, and when you ask for the advance deposit, it would stop the clock. So that those things didn't quite really match up. We changed it so that now, if a requester asks for an estimate in advance, you send the estimate, that does stop the clock when you send the estimate until they respond. And if they don't respond within 30 days, the request is deemed to be withdrawn. This way, you got a chance to talk and work out whatever deal you need to. The second part of it, of course, with advance deposits, that remains the same, that anytime it's going to go over 200, you as the public body can demand the advance deposit up to the full amount of your estimate. I talked to somebody just the other day who said they had, I think it was a $1,500 estimate. They asked for their advance deposit of $200. The requester sent them a letter back saying, well, here's the $200, please proceed, since that's what you asked for, but I don't agree to pay $1,500. And so now they're kind of in a limbo because they don't know if they're going to be able to collect that money or not. But since they only asked for $200, that's all they get in advance. So I would encourage you, when you have any big dollar situation like that, whatever your actual estimate is, and it has to be, a good faith estimate, ask for that full amount. Don't make collections an issue later if you don't have to. The other part of that, I want to note that we changed this year. It used to talk about the requester agreeing to pay the advance deposit. And so some people would say that just meant they have to tell you they will pay. It did not mean a check in hand. There was at least one case where the court said it does mean a check in hand, but we changed it in the law. So now it just says to pay. So it's clear they have to actually pay the advance deposit before you process the request. Last one there, if you've billed somebody for records and they don't pay it and it goes unpaid 30 days or more, you do not have to respond to any new requests from that person until they pay the outstanding balance. Next one here, exemptions of general application. For anyone who hasn't looked through it yet, FOIA has definitely over 100 records exemptions. I have heard people say it's 150 or so. I actually heard someone recently say 170. So there are a lot of FOIA exemptions for records. The first section of FOIA, you'll see most of these are in 2.2, 3705.1. That is the section we talk about as exemptions of general application. And that means anybody can use them. Things like personnel records, attorney-client, etc. Any public body can use those. Most of the rest of the sections are specific in that the exemptions will specify not only what type of records they cover, but which public body is allowed to use them. So they tend to be much more specific in the other sections. We already talked a little bit about personnel records, so I'm not going to rehash that. With attorney is generally communications about legal matters where you're asking for legal advice or they're providing legal advice, and legal memoranda are things prepared for use in litigation or in an administrative investigation. With those ones, your attorney is almost always going to be involved and is probably going to be going through some of those records before you turn them over. So if you have questions about that, you can call me, but I'll warn you, this is one of the ones where I commonly will tell people to talk to their attorney rather than me, specifically because I am not your attorney, and both of those are exemptions that can be waived by talking to other people in too much detail. So you're not gonna be able to tell me the specifics without waiving the exemption, so I'm gonna tell you, go ahead and just talk to your attorney anyway. The next two bullet points, contract negotiations and procurement exemptions, I like to talk about them together. They're all very similar in concept, but they differ in the details. The contract negotiations exemption is specifically for contract negotiations that are not under the Procurement Acts. The other ones are for ones that are under the Procurement Acts. All of them generally protect things that can jeopardize your bargaining position or negotiating strategy up until a contract is awarded. And once the contract's awarded, things become open. That's kind of the general rule. That's pretty much it for the contract negotiations exemption. It does not have any protections that continue after the contract is awarded. So everything becomes open there. With the procurement exemptions, they do have some specific protections that continue, particularly for proprietary information and trade secrets. And there's a process to go through for protecting those, and it varies depending on which procurement act you're under. So all of that obviously can get fairly complicated. If you have questions about that, I would encourage you to shoot us an email or give us a call. The last one is for financial records. Could be credit cards, debit cards, financial account records. You're allowed to pull out the account and routing numbers. Generally, however, keep in mind, account records are usually open. Invoices, accounts receivable, payable, et cetera, ledgers, all that kind of stuff is generally open. It's just the account and routing numbers that can be protected. All right, turning now to public meetings. We're going to cover a little bit of the procedures for open, closed, and electronic meetings. Going to go through this again fairly quickly. We got about 15 minutes to get through all this stuff. So we're going to kind of hit highlights. First off, policy. Again, all meetings have to be open unless they're closed following a particular exemption. We're going to talk about the definitions of what is a public body, what is a meeting. We're going to talk about some of the rules for open meetings, then rules for closed meetings. And very briefly, we're going to hit on the electronic meetings. For let's see, yeah, there we go. Definition of public body. The first one's pretty obvious. This is all your normal legislative body, authority, board, bureau, blah, 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 blah. Soil Water Conservation District. Yes, the board is going to be subject to FOIA as a public body. Second bullet point, a little more interesting. Anytime you set up a committee, subcommittee, or an other entity, however designated, so it could be a task force or work group, citizens group, whatever you want to call it. But if you set it up as a public body to perform a delegated function or to advise you as a public body, then it also is a public body. I'm getting a whole lot of stuff right now because today is actually the deadline for electronic meetings reports. And of course, there's been a lot of those this year. And I had the question not even an hour ago about, hey, what about all our committees? Do they have to submit an electronic meetings report too? Yeah, technically they do because they're all public bodies as well. Okay, it also includes other organizations, corporations, or agencies that are supported wholly or principally by public funds. This typically catches tax-exempt organizations, some charities, 501c3, 501c3, C6. I think there's also C4s we've seen. But those type of organizations, most common examples are things like volunteer fire and rescue squads that get public money to support their activities. There's a few others. I think we've had area agencies on aging and some other things. Again, the rule of thumb there, for principal support, we've said anything over 2/3 is clearly and pretty much unquestionably going to be the principal source. Technically, the dictionary definition of principal source would just mean the single largest. We have seen that go down to as low as about 50% in at least one court case where it said it was just over 50% public funds, and the actions that the organization was engaged in were governmental in nature, so they made them subject to FOIA. It's got to be judged on a case-by-case basis. So again, if you have questions on that, please give us a call. Last, already mentioned this, constitutional officers, they are included, but only for records, not for meetings purposes. Excuse me. For the definition of meeting, going to break this down kind of like we did with public records. Note at the very beginning, it includes meetings, including work sessions. Sometimes people call me up and say, well, it was just a work session, not a meeting. Well, a work session by definition in the code is a meeting. So don't ever think it's not. Work sessions are meetings. Next part of it, when sitting physically or through electronic communication means as a body or entity or an informal assemblage. Well, so this idea of assemblage has been examined by the Supreme Court of Virginia, and they said it implies an element of simultaneity. This is where we've seen stuff where people have alleged email as a meeting between different members of a board. There have been two cases. One was Beckford Shelton in 2004. In that case, emails went out to a number of members, but there was a delay in time between any email being sent and any response being sent back. And I think it was 4 or 4.5 hours in between. And the court said because of that, this was not a meeting. It was more akin to a letter or a memo. The next case was Hill versus Fairfax School Board, and I think it was 2012. And this time they were very close in time. The plaintiffs actually showed me one of their exhibits that showed emails about 1.5 minutes apart. But this is where we go to the next part of the exemption. As many as 3 members are a quorum if less than 3 of the constituent membership. In the Hill case, the emails were close in time, but they were all one-on-one. They didn't have 3 members or a quorum involved in any of the emails. I think the court said there was one email that was distributed to 3 or more members, but it was a straight distribution with no replies. So again, there was no real-time communication in sufficient numbers to make it a meeting. Keep in mind the next part, wherever held with or without minutes being taken, whether or not votes are cast of any public body. This means if you run into 3 other members or 2 other members, say at the movie theater or the grocery store, well, these things are less likely because of COVID, nobody's going out as much. But if you do just run into people, that can be a meeting. There are exceptions that we're going to talk about in just a minute. The idea though is anytime there's 3 or more of you together talking soil water conservation district business, or if you set up usually it's a subcommittee of some kind that only has 2 or 3 members. If you set it up that way so that a quorum is only 2, that's the quorum of less than 3, then anytime those 2 members get together and talk SWCD business, that's going to be considered a meeting. Okay, so when you look at the next 2 bullet points, we already covered that. So going on to the exceptions. Employees don't count. So you don't count your employees when adding up how many members are present. Second bullet point, if no part of your purpose is discussion or transaction of public business, that's also an exception. So it's my example, you run into a couple other members at the movie theater, at the grocery store, at a county fair, wherever it might be. Well, you're not there for SWCD business. It's not a meeting, but you still have to avoid talking SWCD business or else you turn it into a meeting. So just make sure you don't talk public business outside of meetings. Next one, public forum, candidate appearance or debate, purpose of which is to inform the electorate and not to discuss or transact public business. This is typically, debates are obvious, candidate appearances, things like town hall meetings, something where say one member wants to get together with the people in their district and say, this is what we are doing, this is what I have done. Or if it's a debate, they might have a, opponent for the next election and you want to get up and debate the issues. And you're also going to talk about what you did as a member. And they're going to talk about what they're going to do if they get elected as a member. Well, any of those things, the other members might want to hear what y'all have to say. And so this allows them to go and to listen, but don't participate, don't discuss or transact public business. Just let the people who are on the dais, on the stage, whoever's actually debating or holding a town hall meeting, that kind of thing, or giving their appearances and speeches as a candidate, let them talk. But if you're there as another member, you still have to remember, anywhere you go, you're bringing all of the FOIA requirements with you. So you still cannot discuss or transact public business with them, okay? Moving on, the open meetings requirements. You always have to have 3 things. Notice, it's gotta be open to the public, and you gotta take minutes. For the notice, it only has to have the date, the time, and the location of the meeting. You do not have to put your agenda in it. We'll talk agendas in just a minute. For local bodies, notice has to be posted in 3 places. First is your official public government website, if any. So if you have an official website, put your notice there. This is on a practical level where most people get their notices these days. Second is prominent public location in which notices are regularly posted. This can be a lot of different places. Could be town hall, could be the courthouse, could be a public library. It can be a local newspaper of general circulation. where people are used to looking for notices there. My personal favorite was someone who said, if I really want to reach people in my small town, I'm going to post it up on the cork board and food line. And I said, okay, as long as it's a prominent place where people are actually going to see it, that's the goal. The last one is the office of your clerk or chief administrator if you do not have a clerk. For regular meetings, you have to post at least 3 working days in advance of the meeting, meaning you do not count the day of the meeting as a working day. Again, legal holidays and weekends generally do not count either. For special emergency or continued meetings, it's got two parts to it. First, it's got to be reasonable in the circumstance, which, just like when we talked about reasonable charges, that's something only a court can determine for sure. You can kind of ballpark it, but only a court can tell you for certain whether something is reasonable, and it will vary with the circumstance. Second, it has to be posted same time members are notified. Last bullet point here, people can sign up usually for an email list. They can say they don't want email, in which case you would notify them by other means. But typically these days, people just have an email list. So the usual way this works is people post to their website. They put up the 2 physical postings at the prominent public location and the office of the clerk or administrator, and then they send out notice to the email list. Just make sure with the special emergency or continued meetings, do all that at the same time you notify the members. For a meeting to be open to the public, it means literally that the public is able to come in. It can have a closed door. If you're doing a closed door meeting, like for example, with the General Assembly, because we have so many people in the building during normal years, they always close the doors to meetings because otherwise there's so many people in the hall, you can't hear what's going on inside. So you want to keep the doors closed, but they're unlocked. And they'll have a sign up that says, this meeting, whatever it is going on, so people know they can come in. You also have to allow the public to record, photograph, film, or otherwise reproduce the meeting, but you can tell them where to place the equipment so it does not interfere with the meeting. So my examples, if somebody just wants to hold a little camcorder or their cell phone up, that's usually fine. But if somebody wanted to use flash photography, we've seen at least one court case where they said you had to sign up in advance to let us know because it's distracting. If somebody wanted to set up, a full-size news camera up on a big tripod or something, and they want to put it in the center of the room in front of the audience, you could say no, put it off to the side, that kind of stuff. However, last 2 bullet points here, very important with COVID-19 right now. FOIA does not address logistics. We don't talk about how many people you have to let in. We say it has to be something where the public may be present. With COVID-19, a lot of people are using electronic means to allow a public presence, even though it's not a physical presence. So we're definitely going to encourage you, use live streaming, broadcast on local TV or radio. A lot of people have, some sort of local cable you can broadcast on. You can post recordings of your meetings. Anything you do to increase public awareness is a good thing. For meeting minutes, you only have to take them at open meetings, not at closed meetings. You have to include date, time, and location. You also have to have members of the public body present or absent. And then the next bullet point is the fun one, a summary of matters discussed, deliberated, or decided. Normally, we tell you do not need a verbatim transcript or a full recording of a meeting. There can be an exception right now if people are using the budget language to hold electronic meeting. Those do require either a recording or a transcript, but otherwise it's normally a summary, and you have a certain amount of leeway to decide, how much detail to include or exclude. Last 2 bullet points, you do have to have a record of any votes taken, any motions to enter a closed meeting, and the certification after a closed meeting. With agendas, going back to that issue, you have to have a copy of your proposed agenda and any materials that are not exempt available for public inspection at the same time you give them to the members. I spoke with someone about that today as well. There's no specific time. If you hand it out at the meeting itself, then just have an extra copy for the public to see, put it up on a front table or something like that. If you hand out things a week in advance, have an extra copy ready at the office for somebody to come in and look at. Those are the normal situations with COVID-19. We're encouraging, put stuff up on your website as much as possible. Most people are going to get it there anyway. But technically you just have to have a copy for people to look at whenever you give it to the members. Keep in mind, FOIA does not address parliamentary procedure, agenda items, agenda contents, agenda changes. I've had people say, oh, hey, the notice didn't mention they were having a closed session. I don't care. There's no requirement for a notice to mention closed sessions. That may be an agenda item. There may be other requirements out in other, if you have bylaws or other parliamentary procedures that you've adopted, anything like that, They might set forth rules, but FOIA does not. For closed meetings, you got to have your motion, then your discussion, then your certification. So let's go through that. When you have your motion for entering a closed meeting, you got to have 3 items. First, you got to ID your subject. Second, state your purpose. And 3, cite your code exemption. When you identify the subject matter, that's the hard part, because FOIA 2.23711A, I'm going to read you the actual language here. First thing it says before listing out, it's about, I think, 54 meeting exemptions right now. First thing it says is public bodies may hold closed meetings only for the following purposes. That means if you quote or paraphrase from the exemption, the statutory language, that states the purpose, because it says right there, those are the purposes. So 2 of the 3 of these, the number 2 and number 3, are gimmies. You just go 2.23711A and then the subsection, whatever number it is, that'll give you your exemption. Then you can quote or paraphrase from it. That'll state your purpose, but then you have to do something more. Specifically in the section 2.23712A, where it talks about this motion to enter a closed meeting, specifically says, and I'm quoting here, a general reference to the provisions of this chapter, the authorized exemptions from open meeting requirements, or the subject matter of the closed meeting shall not be sufficient to satisfy the requirements for holding a closed meeting. So the classic example, we're going to have a closed meeting for a discussion of a personnel matter pursuant to 2.23711A1 is not a sufficient motion. It doesn't have a subject. Saying personnel matter is just quoting or paraphrasing the exemption. That's your purpose, but it doesn't have a subject. Examples, we're going to do the annual performance review of the executive director pursuant to 2.23711A1. Well, that's great. You know it's performance review, that's your purpose. 3711A1 is your site, executive director is your subject. You can do that, and that's fine. You don't want to have to be so specific that you're defeating your reason for going into the closed session, but you always do have to do something more than just quoting or paraphrasing the exemption. All right, for the closed meeting discussion, keep in mind you are limited to the items you identified in your motion that are lawfully allowed to be discussed under FOIA in closed meeting. If you stray off topic, that would be a violation, so don't do it. You don't have to take minutes in a closed meeting, but if you do, they would be exempt from FOIA. But keep in mind, somebody might still come along and subpoena them. Last one, who may attend? Non-members can attend if you find them to be necessary or that they will reasonably aid your consideration of the topic under discussion. And then, excuse me, last bullet point there, other members may also attend but not participate when it is a sub-entity. For example, if the board creates a committee or subcommittee, the committee or subcommittee is holding a closed meeting and you want to go to attend. Let's say the classic example here, you create a executive search committee because you're hiring a new executive director. And you've got, say, 3 people on that committee, and the other board members want to go to the closed meeting where they're discussing candidates because they want to hear who's coming up for review. They can go, but they cannot participate. So if you're not a member of the sub-entity, the committee, subcommittee, etc., then you can attend the meeting, but stay quiet. Don't participate at all. Next, certification. After the closed meeting's over, you have to certify that you only discuss the things you ID'd in your motion that are lawfully allowed to be discussed in closed meeting. General Assembly heard a number of examples from different areas of the state, both local and state level public bodies, where people had certified closed meetings and come out later and said, oh, we did it wrong, I should not have certified. They felt it was necessary to impose an additional penalty. So there is an additional penalty now for improper certification. We have not seen it imposed yet by a court, but it is out there, so be aware of it. On voting, keep in mind, votes must be taken at a meeting conducted in accordance with FOIA. It's going to be at an open meeting. You can't have written or secret ballots. That means no voting by email. If you're in a closed meeting, you are allowed to take a straw poll or reach consensus, but decisions are not effective until you vote in the open meeting. Just as we did with records, some of the common exemptions for meetings include personnel, scholastic records for students, the acquisition or disposition of real property, discussion of a prospective business or industry coming to the locality where no announcement has been made of their interest, actual or probable litigation, specific legal matters, Public safety issues, I would note this one is generally things like building security, cybersecurity, anti-terrorism measures. We've seen people occasionally say, oh, well, you know, the local police want to update us on a matter. That's not covered. There's no exemption for that. And then the last one there, award of public contract. Just want to note, when we talked about record side, there was the general exemption for contracts that are not under a Procurement Act, and then there were specific exemptions for the Procurement Acts. This meetings exemption has been interpreted by the Supreme Court to mean procurement discussions. It does not actually refer directly to a Procurement Act, but the court has interpreted it that way. And so that would be the one for procurements. And then for other things, you'll see, like, for example, that third bullet point, acquisition and disposition of real property. That one is usually a purchase, sale, or lease, which means you're negotiating a contract. So it corresponds, but only for real property. So the meeting section is not directly correspond to the records section for exemptions, but there are some equivalents. All right, moving on to electronic meetings very quickly because we're pretty close to out of time. As of 2020, this year, we have now 6 processes for electronic meetings. 5 of them are in FOIA, 1 is now in the state budget. 4 of those can be used by any public body. 1 of them is for regional bodies only, 1 of them is for state level bodies only, so you can pretty much ignore those 2. For the local bodies, you can always use the 2, and this is for any body, but personal matters that prevent attendance or a medical condition or disability that prevents attendance. Keep in mind, for both of those, you have to have a quorum present physically first. There's got to be a participation policy in place, and the remote member's voice has to be heard at the main location. The other limit, personal matters right now, is limited to 2 per calendar year. I'll tell you, the FOIA Council has recommended legislation for next year that would change that to 2 or 25% of the meetings, rounded up, whichever is greater. So that would be a change there. Also, as part of that, they've also recommended expanding the medical condition to include taking care of a sick family member. And note that medical condition or disability is not limited in number. The next 2 are both when the governor has declared the state of emergency. The one that's been in FOIA for years is limited in purpose to responding to the emergency. With COVID-19 lasting as long as it has, that clearly wasn't enough because people had to get other business done. And so they enacted new rules in the budget to allow for broader purposes. I believe you've all probably gotten some guidance from either, I forget now, DCR and your Attorney General, I think it was, that talks about the limits with the new budget language. So I'll defer to that for you. But keep in mind, all of those can be used by anyone, and you do not have to have a quorum in place. You do not have to have a policy stated in advance, but you do otherwise have to comply with the rules in 2.2 3708.2. Okay, next, always with any of these, if you cannot participate because you cannot meet whatever the procedural rules are, you're still allowed to listen or watch. That's your right as a citizen to watch meetings. You just can't participate. You cannot be counted as present. You can't make motions. You can't vote. So you can still listen or watch, but not participate. Also, just as we said before, employees don't count towards who we're counting as being there for the meeting anyway. So public and staff can always participate electronically, even if it's just a normal meeting, and you don't have to worry about those other rules because those rules apply to the members only. We also have an electronic meetings guide on the FOIA Council website, and that again is a hyperlink to it if you go to the PowerPoint. Finally, a little note about social media here. The way the definitions work and the way social media works, something that's posted on social media can be a public record. And if you got 3 or more people talking in real time that are members of the public body, it can also be a meeting. So social media can pretty much implicate all sides of FOIA here. So be aware of that. One of the big issues we always hear about social media is, well, what about keeping it? How long do I keep posts? How do I keep posts? We also hear about people saying, well, I have a citizen that keeps posting, you know, something you don't want there. They're cursing, they're posting ads, they're doing whatever it is. Can I block them? Can I block their posts? Can I hide their posts? Can I delete their posts? Unfortunately, all that stuff falls outside of FOIA. A lot of that becomes First Amendment issues and record retention issues. So I'm going to have to direct you to other sources to talk about those issues. Next, we're going to do this quick as I can. Remedies and penalties, what happens when things goes wrong. Enforcement, as I said, is through the court system. The basic mechanism is a petition for mandamus or injunction supported by an affidavit showing good cause. Mandamus is when the court orders you to do something. Injunctions when they order you not to do something. It is the petitioner's choice to file either in general district court or circuit court. Venue is always going to be in your locality where the body is, and a single violation is enough to invoke the remedies. With the basic petition, it is supposed to be heard within 7 days of filing, but the petitioner must notify the public body before they file, so you do have a chance to be aware of it and respond. If the petitioner wins, you are to be, they will be awarded the court costs, attorney's fees, and expert witness fees. Keep in mind that can be a lot. The case where I talked about the meetings exemption that the court interpreted as applying to procurement records, it started in general district court. It went then to circuit court, then to the Supreme Court. And my understanding is at the end of it, the petitioner won, and they remanded it for a determination of attorney's fees, which totaled over $93,000. So that could be a lot of money. Last bullet point here, when you've used an exemption, the other side can't see what you're withholding or what you did in a closed meeting. And so it shifts the burden to you as the public body to prove that the exemption applies. There are some additional penalties for willful and knowing violations. That can be a $500 to $2,000 penalty for the first, $2,000 to $5,000 for second and subsequent violations. These penalties would be paid by the individual found to have committed the violation. They are not paid by the public body. They go to the literary fund, so it's not like the person on the other side is getting rich here, but it does come out of your pocket if you commit a knowing and willful violation, so don't do it. Do keep in mind you can introduce our advisory opinions that you relied on in good faith as evidence that it was not a willful and knowing violation. Other additional penalties are for improper alteration or destruction of public records with the intent to avoid FOIA. That penalty is up to $100 per record, in addition to other penalties, and again, paid by the individual, not by the public body, to the literary fund. If I didn't mention it before, the Library of Virginia administers the Public Records Act and sets all the retention schedules, and at the end, there will be a link to the library's website where you can find those schedules. The last additional penalty here, as I mentioned before, improper certification of closed meetings. That would be a civil penalty up to $1,000. This time it is paid by the public body, not by the individual. Again, paid to the literary fund. And there are mitigating factors the court can consider as reliance on opinions from the Attorney General, court cases, or published advisory opinions from the FOIA Council. Last part is the additional resources. I'm just going to leave it right here as FOIA Council and Library of Virginia. Again, call us anytime you have access questions, and the library is your resource for record retention questions. Other than that, DCR and the Attorney General, I believe. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the sharing and go to the chat here. We have a good number of questions. So,
I really do. Thank you, Alan. Yeah. I appreciate that. And just to try to help you with the chat box a little bit, apologies for my own technical issues there earlier, but you covered a lot of material in a short time frame. So thank you for those who hung in there. But at this point, we really do want to capture those questions, and I'm hoping you're getting a chance to scroll through them. I know we have one from Mr. Lund that's, when providing records, can we ask for receipts for records provided? Go ahead.
I'm not sure. What do you mean by receipts? To acknowledge that the requester received it? Or what?
I assumed that was how I interpreted it. Also, I'm not sure Mr. Lund has a mic by chance with us today. So if
yes,
you needed clarification, there you go.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I suppose you could send something, return receipt requested, if you want to, but I would keep in mind, don't charge the requester for that, because that's something you're doing for your own self, for your own records. And also, as I mentioned earlier, consequence of choice. If you do a return receipt requested on your FOIA request response, that's something else that once you get that return receipt, you're gonna have to keep it with the rest of your FOIA request records for at least 3 years. So can you do it? Yeah, I think you can, but you can't charge them for it, and you would have to keep it.
Helpful. You have another question from Mr. Lund. Are interview teams talking to prospective employees of public body? Also, what about working groups or task forces without decision authority, i.e. to investigate an issue or develop recommendations for consideration by the body with decision-making authority? Are they public bodies subject to all the meeting requirements?
If, depending on how they're set up, I'll give you an example. At my agency, you know, the managers may interview new employees. They're not a public body, they're employees themselves. Whereas with the board of a soil water conservation district, if your directors, get together and they're conducting an interview, then yeah, if you've set up a committee or subcommittee to do that, yes, it is a public body. If you say, and I don't know how big your staff might be, but if you tell your executive director, get a couple other people together and you guys do the interviews, we're not going to do it. That would be giving an assignment to staff. That would not be a public body. So it depends on how you do it.
Perfect. We have a question from Deanna Fear of Piedmont District. Is the chat box of any video conference meeting platform part of the public record of the meeting? And what about those private conversations that might be happening on chat box?
What private conversation? This is where another example of social media. I would say that everything I'm looking at in this chat box, since these are questions and Kendall's reading them aloud anyway, I'd say yes, this is part of the record of this training. Personally, I have it up on my screen. I don't know if the recording itself is catching that or not. But I would say, otherwise, yeah, it's a record. As far as private conversations, this is one of the cautionary tales about social media, especially. I've talked to people who said, well, we have a private Facebook group. And this was, well, I'll just tell you straight up. It was the parent of a special needs child who was a member of their local special education advisory committee, which is a committee of the school board. It is a public body. It is subject to FOIA. And they were talking about special needs issues on a private Facebook group. Because of their position on the body, they knew things and they were discussing things that were public business. Technically, all of that stuff in that private group that they were part of for that was a public record. It should not have been private. But someone, and this is where you get some really interesting issues because, somebody else set up that group and there's the Facebook term of service issues and all sorts of stuff. And for all these reasons, you will not find a FOIA Council Twitter account. We don't have one. We've avoided those issues. But yeah, that stuff can come up. I had another one with public defenders years and years ago who had a private kind of a chat forum just online on the internet where they had their own forum. And they became very concerned when we were talking about definition of public records because they realized a whole bunch of stuff on their forum would have been a public record. And not only the prosecuting attorneys and judges could have FOIA'd it, but their defendants, the cops, anybody involved, witnesses, victims, could have FOIA'd that stuff. So they were kind of, they became a little bit leery, and I think they changed the way they handled that.
I think you have one question that kind of ties in with this one in the chat box at the bottom. Are we obligated to save chat box comments during electronic meetings? While districts certainly are doing it as part of their record, if that director was having a private conversation with someone, I guess that's potentially where I lend that. And if so, is there a recommended required method of saving?
Right, and that one I get to direct over to the Library of Virginia because we do all the records management, record retention rules. I can tell you typically the record retention rules range from delete it when you're done all the way up to permanent retention and pretty much anything and everything in between. Tends to be longer. The more important it is, the more historic value it has, and the more important the person is who is making the record. So, things like the governor issuing a new public policy that's going to affect everyone in the state. There are already rules about governor's papers, but that's the kind of thing they're going to want to retain. Definitely. If it is your executive director setting out a policy that's going to affect everyone in your district, then yeah, there's probably some rules about retaining it. Whereas if it's the front desk staff person sending somebody a notice that, hey, member X got stuck in traffic and is going to be 15 minutes late to the next meeting, you probably delete that when you're done. That's not a big deal, but it's all everywhere from 0 to forever. So
that's really helpful, Alan. And certainly our admin ops committee has tackled a lot of those record retention issues. We will certainly talk with Library of Virginia folks and make that a part of our kickoff for 2021 to make sure we're handling all of those correctly too. You have two other questions, I think, in the chat box still. When are agendas supposed to be made public? Is it 3 days before the meeting?
No, the agendas are put out whenever they're given to the members. So if you give it to the member at the meeting, put the public copy for inspection up at the meeting. If you give it out a week in advance, then it'd be a week in advance. If it's 3 days in advance, 3 days in advance. So whenever you do it, the notice has to be 3 days before the meeting. But the agenda and the notice are separate requirements.
That's excellent clarification. And I believe the last question we have in our chat box is Frida Cathcart. Who can bring the charge of incomplete FOIA records?
And let me ask for a little clarification. Do you mean like an incomplete response of someone saying, oh, you didn't give me all the records you have or something?
Yeah, I can give you specific.
Sure.
If a reporter did a FOIA request for information about a specific subject, a person, and most of it was sent to the reporter, but specifically something was left out that would have put the thing in context, and leaving that out reflected poorly on the person. Can only the reporter bring charges for FOIA requests, or can the person that had the context left out that it did harm with the reporting bring charges against them?
Oh, I'm gonna have to put on my lawyer hat for a minute. If it was the reporter who made the request, they could allege a violation of FOIA in that they could say, hey, for example, I understand there was more to this record, or that you had additional records that were responsive, and I don't believe that they were exempt, and I believe you should have released them. So that would be something that the reporter could allege. As far as the person who's the subject of the record, who says, well, you only released part, and as a result, it sounds like you're getting to almost a defamation claim, that would be a separate thing that they would go through their own attorney. It wouldn't be a FOIA violation. That would be, their claim of defamation or retaliation or whatever it might be. With FOIA, this is something to keep in mind. I mean, FOIA, as a general rule, it's all about releasing records. And so almost all the exemptions, there are about 2 actual prohibitions in FOIA, but other than those 2, everything else in FOIA is discretionary, and that includes the personnel records exemption. So, if you want to, you can withhold, for example, all employee personnel evaluations. You don't have to release those. Those are personnel records, you can withhold them. If you want to, you can release them. You can say, here's the performance evaluations for every employee for the last 10 years or something. And if you did that, it would not be a FOIA violation. On the other hand, I know from experience talking to local government attorneys, they all say, don't release personnel records unless you have to. The danger is they get misconstrued somehow, misinterpreted, or as you're saying, you release part of them, but not the whole thing, so it's out of context, and it may lead to some sort of claim of retaliation, defamation, something else like that. But it's not a FOIA violation. So the person wouldn't sue you under FOIA, but could they sue you? Maybe. That's something I'd leave them to discuss with their attorney.
I appreciate that. And I imagine Frida may want to chat with you a little bit more on that question, and has asked for your direct phone number. We can certainly share Alan's contact information in the follow-up email we'll be sending to everyone after this session, along with the recording and materials. Last 2 questions at this time. Does the obligation to provide to public at time provided to members applicable to other meeting materials also provided? And is it applicable to in-person meetings as well as electronic meetings?
Yes and yes, unless it's exempt. So, for example, let's say you're hiring a new executive director, and as part of this, you have materials that just list the job position, the expected job duties, and the minimum qualifications required for the position. All of that would be open record. If that's part of your meeting materials that you're giving to the search, whatever, then yes, that would be released along with the agenda for public inspection. If you also had all of the individual candidates' resumes and cover letters and all that kind of stuff as well, that stuff's all exempt, and so you would withhold that. You do not have to put exempt materials with the other agenda materials. I do see the next question about, do they have to be made available or just posted such as on the website? For agendas, technically it is available for public inspection. On a practical level, when you put it on the website, that's where most people get it, and you won't get other requests because most people just download it themselves and get it there. If somebody was to walk into the office, you just have to make it available for public inspection. Prior to COVID, I would say that means have a copy that you print out and, hand to them. With COVID and so many public buildings being closed and everything, I mean, it can be just turning a terminal around that they can see. Logistically, it's something every public body has different resources, so they're going to have to work it out for themselves.
I don't see any other questions in the chat box right now. Alan, I want to say a big thank you for your presentation and hanging in there longer for our questions that we had. We'll be following up with everyone with the video of this presentation as well as the materials. When you say clerk, are you referring to clerk up the circuit court for the certificate?
No, for the certificates, that would be the clerk actually of the governing body or the school board is the way that it's phrased.
So it would be kept in your office with your staff, and we'll certainly be providing those certificates to those who participated today, partly why that chat box was helpful, and so many of those staffers let us know they'd have multiple people in their office taking the training together. So stay tuned. We'll be following up. Shannon Mitchum in our office will be sending you all an email within the week to provide you certificate details, recording, and having all of this also posted on our website for those who couldn't join today for the session live.
Okay.
With that, unless there are any other questions, I want to say simply thank you and happy holidays.
Happy holidays, y'all.